Hi guys, and welcome to lesson 7 of our population topic. This is going to be the final lesson in terms of new content, and then we're going to do a little bit of revision and a very short multiple choice assessment for the next 2 lessons after this. But today we are focusing on something called the one-child policy, which was employed by China as a result of their population growth. And we're going to really look at exactly why this was the case and exactly why it was so controversial as well. So, as always, your activity is to watch the video, and there are going to be a few times here where I ask you to pause the video to complete some activities. And then finally, at the end, there are 3 review questions. I would like you to upload your answers to those review questions onto Satchel 1 at the end. So, we know so far, based on this entire topic, that China had a population explosion and now China has a population problem. The Chinese population has increased dramatically, and we know from our previous lessons that that has led to a population disaster. Primarily, that problem is focusing on the impact on the environment. So in the previous lesson, we were looking at those cancer cities. We were looking at PM 2.5, which is the air pollution that causes that cancer. We were looking at how their industry has polluted the waterways. And we were also looking at how the effects of burning fossil fuels was causing things like acid rain in that city, Guangzhou. It's also caused problems with things like infrastructure and healthcare because as the population has increased so dramatically, it's resulted in huge strain on those resources. So there aren't enough good houses to support the new people. The healthcare could not cope with the rising numbers of people because even though they could train more nurses, more doctors, etc., they could not do it fast enough to really help out people enough, and therefore China's health was struggling as a direct result of that. Now, obviously, all these factors link together, and the idea is, like I said, China has a population explosion. It has created a bit of a disaster for them. So what happened was, the Chinese government had to come up with a plan of how they were going to solve this. And the plan they came up with was perhaps one of the most controversial policies in history. Even now, academics and universities still debate what the impact of this policy was or is, and it's a really, really contentious issue. And that policy was something called the one-child policy. And the idea was that they would try to solve the problem of overpopulation through only allowing families to have one child. Okay, so it was introduced in 1979, and the idea was that they were only allowed to have one child, not 2, not 3, 1. And the idea, from their perspective, was that if they reduced the number of children that people were having, the population would either stop increasing or the increase would slow down, allowing them to sustain what resources they actually still had. Now, the idea that the government said at the time was that they wanted to make sure that China could support its large population with facilities like healthcare, education, housing, good jobs, and most importantly, food. Because as that population increased, demand for these resources increased, and China was becoming increasingly strained. They were really, really struggling to provide everything that people needed for these groups. And so they introduced the policy, and that was the idea. They also wanted to reduce poverty and improve the overall quality of life for the people. Now, China is an NEE, a newly emerging economy. In the past, it was definitely an LIC, and the idea was that by improving the quality of life, the Chinese government would also improve the development of the country. So on paper, the premise of this policy is fairly good. They're trying to stop the overpopulation, which we know is a bad thing. They were trying to improve quality of life. They were trying to reduce poverty. However, it wasn't a particularly well thought out policy. And as we're going to look at now, there have been long lasting impacts as well. Before we get into that though, I want to show you a little image, and this picture is a piece of Chinese propaganda. Now, propaganda, if you look at that in history, is kind of an image that makes you support the government's view. So there are 3 questions with that. The first one is describe what the poster shows. The second one, what is the message of the poster? And thirdly, how does it promote the one-child policy? So if you have a rough piece of paper or a Word document open, can you use that and rough work, jot down 3 answers to the following and pause the video and then unpause it once you're done. Okay, so the poster is showing the kind of idealistic Chinese family, and they've got their little one child there. I think the message is very clearly that if you only have one child, you're still going to be really happy. So if you look at the people, the same with the third question really, they look really, really happy. They've got that one child. Everything seems pretty hunky-dory with them. So, as it's geography, we need to look at the pros and the cons of this policy. So what I want to do now is I want to go and find a piece of paper, or alternatively, you can open a Word document if you do not have access to that. And on your piece of paper, I want you just to jot down a very basic 2-column table, one side being pros and one side being cons. Can you pause the video while you do that and then unpause it once you have done that? Okay, hopefully you've drawn that table then. So on the screen now, there are 12 factors about the one-child policy. I do not want you to do all 12 because that would be a little bit silly. What I'd like to do is, I'd like you to see if you can find 2 positive and 2 negative factors of the one-child policy. So can you add on there, on your table, can you, in rough work, draw in 2 positives of the one-child policy and 2 negatives of the one-child policy? Pause the video here and unpause it once you've got 2 of each. Okay, so let's go through them. The country was too cramped. That suggests it's a positive. If the country was getting too cramped, the one-child policy would help that. People were dying of starvation due to lack of food. Again, that is a positive of the one-child policy because by reducing the population, you might have increased that. There is now a lot more men than women in China. Now, that's a negative because it causes an imbalanced population. Because if there's one gender in much more supply, it leads to problems down the line with things like childbirth, etc. The killing of baby girls has increased since the policy was introduced. Yeah, this is a really shocking one, but essentially what happened was a lot of families, because they only allowed one child, they wanted a boy. Now, rightly or wrongly, that was an opinion that was across China, and sadly, it did lead to a lot of babies being killed. So if they had a girl, there was cases of them being drowned. There was cases of orphanages being pretty much entirely filled with girls because they wanted their one child to be a boy. So that's a really sad side effect of the policy. Medical and educational benefits of the child, obviously a positive. Both parents being able to work rather than worried about childcare is definitely positive. The abortion rate went up quite dramatically, and the problem with that was a lot of it wasn't medical abortion, a lot of it was kind of these backstreet ones, so a little bit dangerous for the woman as well. Not a shelter for the people, that's a positive. By reducing the population, that would improve that. Again, babies are being abandoned, particularly baby girls, as couples prefer having boys. Again, if you only allowed one child, and it wasn't, it sounds awful, doesn't it? If there was maybe a disability, if it was the wrong gender, there were a lot of cases of these babies being abandoned or killed. Because it was better than that being your one child. Again, more negative when it goes on to this. There's nobody to look after the elderly. Children did get more time with parents, I guess, on average. There were also really harsh punishments. So the reason why they were killing or putting the babies abandoned was because if they went against the one-child policy, they'd have pretty harsh punishments against them, which is probably a human's right issue, really. So, on that point, we now need to look at what the impacts of that one-child policy are, because it ended a little while ago, but we're still seeing the repercussions today. So this graph here is showing China's fertility rate. And the axis on the left-hand side is showing the children per mother. So if we go back to 1960, the average mother was having 5.8 children, whereas By the time the one-child policy was introduced, that number was 2.5, and after the policy, it's now at around 1.5 or 1.6. So it's clear that the one-child policy did reduce fertility rate, it did reduce the number of children being born, but you would also argue that by the time it was introduced, the fertility rate was actually already going down. So whether they needed to introduce it or not is another story. But the problem we have is that overall, the Chinese population is expected to shrink slightly, but not by a huge amount. And the problem is that it's going to age significantly. Okay, so where it shows is 2018 here, this population pyramid, and it shows how many people are in each age group for both genders. All these people here, in the next sort of 20 years, are going to become very, very old, which means that the vast majority of China's population is going to be aged over 60. And if we look down the bottom here, the number of young people has reduced dramatically. Because they were reducing the amount of children, it's just meant that nowadays, by 2050, as I said, up to about a third of the country's population will be made of people over 60. And that means that those are going to put a huge strain on state services like care homes, like hospitals. And the problem is that because of the one-child policy, there are not as many young people to look after them, basically. So it's going to cause a huge problem in the future for China. But also, China has experienced a rapidly shrinking workforce. They took a gamble and it's backfired a bit. But as we know, one of the big draws of China is a huge manufacturing sector. However, now, because they've had so little birth in comparison, they don't have enough people to kind of fill the demand for that workforce. And so it's going to have a huge economic impact on them in the future, and it might reduce their ability to continue the economic growth that they're currently on. So, to finish it off then, guys, there are 3 review questions. The first one is, why was the one-child policy introduced? Secondly, compare 2 positive and 2 negatives of the policy. That is the table you drew, so you can use your notes for that one. And then finally, what impact has the policy had on modern and future China? That's the final parts there, and I think a lot of the impacts are fairly negative. So, haven't got them questions, you can rewind this video, or if you need any extra support, you can just join the Zoom link.